Hello and welcome to the Mountain West Archive, a podcast where we discuss books about life and culture in the Rocky Mountain West. I'm Ayaz,
I'm Jahan.
and together we've been discussing Ted Conover's book, Cheap Land, Colorado, Off-Gridders at America's Edge. Hey John, how's it going?
Yeah, so we're on chapter 3, and chapter 3 starts out with giving kind of a history of a property that the Grubers want to move to, and Stacy's Gruber's reason for wanting to move is she's kind of tired of living in a trailer, but also the association of living in a trailer, that it's kind of a lesser life form, or I don't know. It's kind of funny to hear that she has judgment for that, because they're so off grid. You'd think they wouldn't care about such things, but I think that it's just, she wants like real plumbing, and she wants some normalcy in her world. So Meg and Josh are introduced as friends of Frank and Stacy's, and really Josh is a friend of Stacy's. And then he marries Meg, who doesn't really like Stacy, and maybe is, I don't know, thinks that she has a crush on Josh, or who knows. But anyway, they kind of live next to each other in trailers for a while, and Josh becomes a bit of a permanent resident. But then we're also introduced to Sam and Cindy, who are other prairie dwellers, but Sam was out there before Frank, and Frank was kind of on blog posts and communicating with randoms at that point. And
Yeah,
a
so
lot of
he's
people
looking for people, contacts in the valley to guide him and try to understand the process, and then that's when
he meets Sam. And the thing that kind of convinces him is there was some talk of it's not a very safe place to bring your kids, and they of course have 4 kids, and Sam tells Frank, "No, man, come on out, it's fine." And then they come out, and Frank gives him a goat, and I forget something else, like a kind of a reasonably useful
plant,
gift.
I think, a marijuana.
Yeah,
to
some
get
weed.
them started as
Okay,
a weed.
to get them started. And they eventually sell their place to the Grubers for $30,000, and they give a bit of a history of that property. So there's another woman that is the original kind of developer, and really in a more of a sense of, she was developing that property because she moves out there. She's kind of in construction, and her husband works for a cell phone company or something. And
Talking about Lisa, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
so she goes out there, builds a well, septic, corrals for horses, and ends up with animals and whatever. And eventually she has some dog she takes in, and the dog is relatively annoying and maybe a little unruly, and she finally has it with the dog and shoots it. And that gives her a bit of a reputation of don't mess with Lisa Foster.
Yeah.
And then she, after living there for a while, and things are going exactly kind of how she wanted them to, building her little compound. And at some point in her history, there's a family living in a car with a kid's playpen sitting next to the car, and there's 4 kids and a man and a woman that are living in this car, and she just feels terrible that the entire family's got to live out there. So she starts bringing them food, and just kind of giving them stuff that she figures they need. And then one day they knock on the door, and she invites them in, and then they end up staying. And it's not a really gracious stay. They just start to take over her house, and she eventually has to get them evicted by the sheriff. And I think that they damaged some of her property, and it just got out of hand.
they also had kids, I think, and then it's like more numbers, and then Sam is alone, and they sort of take over her property and decide to like boss her around and stuff.
Yeah, so then Sam kind of comes in, right? And they him and Cindy assume the property.
Yeah,
But then after they get the property, they get this wild hair to go sailing around the world. So they find somebody to rent their land, and that Lisa Foster developed, and now Sam and Cindy own. And they go and buy a boat in Florida, and they're chugging along, living their life. And the guy that is supposed to be paying rent um, decides he's not going to, and starts kind of claiming that the place is his. And Sam is reaching out to different allies or friends to check on the property, and it's kind of getting questionable on maintenance, and they end up having to end their little sailing venture and come back. And at some point, he's in Texas and asks a friend to check in on him, and eventually the guy just abandoned the place, but he also like ran off with a generator and a few other valuable things and trashes the place and leaves a bunch of junk. I mean, and all of this is just to say that like this is kind of the reality of the landscape. Like you're not just dealing with the harshness and repellent nature of the area, but you also have to deal with the characters that it invites. And
yeah, and Ted also mentions that this is why the rental property, so the rental market in the valley is not as active because it's difficult to trust someone to pay the rent every month, right? You let someone come on the property and then they just stop paying rent, and you have to now deal with eviction and all that sort of thing. And you don't even know the kind of character you're going to end up with living next to you. So
right.
just like this one property, for example, she moves in, she lets someone live with her because they're having a difficult time. They sort of take over her entire place and try to act like they're the owners. She gets them out, gives it to someone else, they rent it out to another person, and then they run into the similar issues of the person is now not paying any rent. So to do these deals, you really have to have a sense of trust in the person that you're dealing with, you know because it's difficult to find someone that is reliable out there.
Yeah, I mean, even the Grubers deal with this with their cousin Ashley, who is
Yeah.
moving in with them to initially because she needs a place to stay, I think is the first excuse. And then they realize that she's trying to do a withdrawal from an opium addiction, and all the kids are, vaguely annoyed with them, just regardless of their age. And she kind of overstays their welcome. So there's a lot of description of you got to watch it, at this part of the world. And I guess some of that is probably the lead in to the next chapter, and what Ted has to consider if he's going to invest in anything out there more permanent, like who he's around, who he can trust, and that kind of thing. It's kind of disappointing that, I mean, it's not surprising, but it's disappointing because there's definitely a sense of survival and community, but there is like a tinge of that zombie apocalypse thing where like, okay, you meet the new guy, but you got your guns out until you can really trust him, and he could kill you, you could kill him, but you're not going to be nice to him just because he's your neighbor,
Yeah,
because he's got to prove
that's sort of the
himself.
flip side of when a lot of people are in a position of need, right? There's the sense of community where everyone helps each other out as well, but there's also the fact that everyone is like trying to steal from you or get as much as they can with doing as little as possible, not paying rent and just taking over your property. Yeah, there is, I think, some of that.
Yeah, and I mean, it's almost like one of the qualifiers for living out there is you have to have a few brushes with the law in your
Yeah.
past, like everyone does. Um, and yeah, I think somewhere in here you get introduced to Nick with the ghost face killer
Free rat.
band or whatever, the creepy tattoo. And like he attacks somebody with a hatchet and gets out of it because of his fetal alcohol syndrome. So, I mean, it's an interesting way
Yeah.
to like introduce characters because you're like, okay, this guy's got to be pretty, questionable guy. And then you're like, oh man, he's got fetal alcohol syndrome. Like he's,
I
not
mean, does he
really
though?
playing with the
So
full deck.
the way I understand it, it's like he is in a place where he has to defend himself, and then his lawyer is looking at, okay, what can be the defense of you running behind someone with a hatchet? So they're like, oh, my mom's an alcoholic. How long has she been an alcoholic for? And then there's like this plausible deniability angle to it, that, oh, we're just going to claim that you have fetal alcohol syndrome because your mom was an alcoholic while she was pregnant with you. And then
Wow.
it's up to the
Okay, that's
court to
even
refute that.
worse
I
because
think that is what is
I just
going
had
on.
some sympathies because I mean, it's vaguely like mental retardation, like the results, and you end up with like kind of physical, um, like your eyes are closer together, and there's like parts of, you know, there's physical effects, not just mental. But I
Yeah.
don't know. I mean, there must be a
I mean,
spectrum,
it
but
could be
it just
that,
sounds like
but maybe I'm just being too skeptical. But I think it's them
a
like
lawyer
trying to
making
get
a
out of
case.
the. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. I didn't really pick up on that. Yeah, you get a little bit of the hang of what it's like out there. And then they also in this intro, they are in the midst of this move and they are hanging on to this bulldozer that's just laden with issues, whether the fuel tank leaks or how it gets filled or, the track comes off or they they drive it at 5 miles an hour across the plains from their old place to their new place, and it takes all night, and it just had to be miserable. And his answer is, why don't you just park it and we'll get it in the morning? And Frank's like, well, somebody would steal it. It's like, I
Somebody
think you'd
could steal this
probably
bulldozer
catch them. It
at
only goes
5 miles an
5 miles an
hour.
hour. Don't leave the keys in it. Like it's just weird that, but it's your possession, so you hold on to what you got, I guess.
I can imagine like Ted just being there and watching them drive this thing at 5 miles an hour and at night in the whatever weather, and wondering what the hell is going on here.
When he makes that comparison to Faulkner's "As I Lay Dying" with the mule and the coffin,
Yeah,
which I
I was
think
going
is
to
kind of
ask you,
funny.
do you understand that reference? Because I know you've read some Faulkner, right?
Yeah,
I
yeah.
haven't.
I mean, it's just part. It's a very strange book. Um, it's actually so my best friend and John Lang. His favorite author is Faulkner, and it's always just puzzled me as to why. Because when I read "As I Lay Dying," it seems like everybody that went through the American school system at some point had to read that and wonder why. Because it's just so weird. But it isn't. It's a funny comparison because it's about all these characters in, I don't know, somewhere in the South. I've forgotten where now. But they're all very poor, and he's doing kind of a version of what Ted is doing, where I mean I don't think that he did an immersive, journalistic kind of style, but he had to know these people and how uneducated and backwards and, dysfunctional they were. So it's a book about those, less talked about people and how, their lives all kind of intertwine and are strange. And
And what is like the
it
reference he's making in this situation?
somebody I don't remember exactly, but somebody dies and they have to take this coffin across, so
Oh,
quite a ways. And it's a slow, you know, plodding mule that's just sadly, marching alone. And that's the reference. But I think the fact that he's mentioning Wagner is, I don't think without reason, because he probably sees some similarities. It may be
yeah,
worth,
between his situation.
yeah, it may be worth a reread of that. I've been thinking about it for a while. It has some weird fact of like it has the shortest chapter ever written in As I Lay Dying, and it's one sentence. I think it's like, my mother was a fish, and that's the chapter. It's very weird. The book is very weird, but also like classic literature, American literature, whatever. So anyway, you want to talk about the the shims, the she hims.
Cool. So that is like the setup in which Ted finds himself. I think so. The way I'm thinking about it is like he came over there in December, and I don't know if all these guys like Nick, Lisa, and all of them were part of the scene back then. I know that we know that he's back now in the summer because he makes a reference at some point that it's June and winter gave way to summer or something like that. So I think he did his stint during the winter, went back to New York, and then came back
Yeah.
during the summer to do, when the colleges are stopped. So I think this is now a newer setup for him since when he was first year. There's more people, there's more chaos, and that is some of the background and characters that he's living with. And one of the things that Ted enjoys while he is in the valley is going out to the beach. And by beach, it's just a sandy portion of the Rio Grande River where they would go and chill with the family. So Stacy would pack a picnic and they would just go there and hang out, and kids would go in the water and have fun. One time when Ted was out there with the Grubers, they noticed a camper trailer parked a few hundred yards away. Frank said the occupants were squatting there over the summer, which, I mean, they don't like because this is a spot where they seems like they come frequently to just have a good time, and it is one of their little joys that they have living on the valley, right? One of the outings that they can do. And to see someone there squatting and you don't really know what they're up to and what's going on when you're not around, it is a little concerning, so they don't like that. As it turns out, they are a trans couple who Stacy refers to as shims because she hims. When Ted later mentioned them to Matt, he says he had seen them in line at the spring where he got water. The man was big and wearing purple heels, and his partner, on the other hand, was a female who embraced a more masculine style. And Matt says that all of this is very unusual for the valley because, as I imagine, like a lot of the people there are very conservative and probably hold very traditional gender and sexual values about men and women. Um, Matt says that he'd seen them around in Fort Garland and Blanca, most, and these are both towns around Alamosa, like smaller, tinier towns. Most recently, he had seen them with their trailer parked in a spot close to his property. A friend of Matt's had noticed a metallic acid smell, almost like battery acid, around the area, and they believed they were cooking meth. There is a rumor around town that these guys were saving up for gender transition in Trinidad, a small town in southern Colorado, a couple hours away from the valley. That was once famous for gender transition operations. So what's interesting is when Mariam and I were driving up from Texas, when we moved to Colorado Springs, we spent the night in Trinidad because that is one of the first towns that you come across as you enter Colorado from the south
Okay.
when you're driving south to north. So we stayed there as a way to like break up the drive and to see a small town before we go into Colorado Springs. And that is when we read a little bit about this. There was apparently a doctor, I want to say it was 20, 30 years ago, sort of made a name for himself for being good at gender transition operations. And that is where the town gets that reputation, which is super weird. A small
Super
town
weird.
in southern Colorado that is known as like a gender transition
Yeah.
mecca for people
Why
in the
there?
US. So, yeah, that is the rumor. And we don't really know if that's true. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but that is an easy prejudice for people to have, right? They're just here because they're trying to save money because Trinidad is a couple hours away. And I don't even know if people are sure whether that doctor is still practicing or anything. So it's just one of
Okay.
those prejudices that take hold and then rumors spread
Right.
based off of those prejudices. Then one day Ted notices Sam's GMC Yukon is all dented up and missing its entire hood. Sam said there had been an altercation while he was down at the beach with Frank, Nick, and Josh. And this is Sam's version of the story. While they were down by the beach at night, the larger of the shims drove up to them in his truck and they exchanged words. After which the guy turned off his headlights and surprised them by ramming Sam's SUV with his pickup truck. It got ugly, shots were fired, and a dog may have been hit. Sam drove onto a rock that he couldn't see in the dark, which damaged his SUV. So this is again suspicious, and I am a little suspicious of his story because we only hear one side of it, right? The story is that we were just going down by the beach at 10 p.m. at night harmlessly just to enjoy the water and the beautiful sky, and this guy just comes out and has an altercation with us and surprises us by ramming his pickup truck into our SUV. I don't buy that. I think what happened, what went down
He was
was
provoked.
these guys have certain opinions of trans people, and they were like, yeah, let's go and show them what's what. And maybe they were drinking while they were down there. Maybe things got out of hand. I feel like the blame of provocation must have been on these guys because if you're that couple, you probably don't want any trouble. If you see people hanging out by the beach at night, you probably just let them go and just let them have their own time and try to stay out of it because you don't want to create an issue. You don't want to get evicted. You don't want to have to move from this property. So I think it's these guys going there and looking for trouble. And uh, especially the next part when Sam said the next day, the guy had driven by his property and shouted at them from the gate. And a day or two after that, he said lightning must have struck because his trailer burned down. So like all of a sudden, they're like, we had this issue with these guys, and then a few days later, their trailer burned down because who knows what. So Ted goes to the site to see it himself and found that the ashes were the main remnants of the trailer, that and the chassis. A short distance away, he sees a single, very large man's sneaker, which he decides to take with him. Apparently, no reports were filed in the aftermath of this incident, and nothing of it made the news. Thinking there is more to the story, Ted asks around if people had seen them. Someone says they had seen them squatting at the foot of Blanca Peak in a different trailer. Ted goes to the site and leaves a La Puente card for them to contact him, but when he returns, they're gone. So they've had this altercation, they've had some trouble with the people, and I think one of these guys went and burned down their trailer, so they go and get a new one. They go and stay at the foot of Blanca Peak, go and, they're camping at a different site, and then Ted goes there and leaves his card behind. I think they, at this point, are very hesitant to talk to anyone because of the experience they've had in the past week or two, even though there's good reason to trust Ted. I don't know if they know him. I don't know if they know what the intention of La Puente is because I don't know how well versed they are with things around the valley. So when they see like an official looking card, I think it scares them a little bit, and they've probably had enough of all the issues and meeting all the people on the valley because these are the interactions that we know about. I'm sure they must have faced other situations with people that may have been difficult for them as well. So even though this is bad enough, this is just one dimension of all the experiences they must be having out in the valley. So eventually they call it quits and they decide to leave. But yeah, that is all we hear about them. And in conclusion to the story, Ted writes, were they criminals cooking meth? It seemed possible. Were they also victims? That too seemed possible. Was prairie justice tainted by anti-gay or anti-trans bias? That seemed possible as well. So on one level, they are criminals in that they're cooking meth illegally and they're selling it, making money off of it. But they're also victims because they're victims of prejudice at the very least. If we don't know if anyone set fire to their trailer, so we don't know if they're victim of that kind of an arsonist assault, but they're at least victim of prejudice that they've had to face, which is obviously sad, right?
I think it's there's another thing in the last chapter about the news. She's like, yeah, we aren't the type of people that really make the evening news or any news for that matter. And
I thought of that as well.
I was kind of conflating those two things because I don't know if Ted is the journalist in this story, you know, and then he truncates it with this, like, could it be this? Yes. Could this be, you know, are they victims? Yes. Do we have anti-trans, anti-gay, you know, prejudices? Also plausible, you know, like all of that is very fair from his perspective. Because I think on the surface, he's, you know, he's just reporting what happened. And I mean, it really smacks of some gay bashing stuff, that in that short amount of time. I mean, why does somebody ram a car if they're already, yeah, it doesn't, the facts don't really add up. I agree. So,
Yeah, and in terms of what
Sam
he has
provoked
written,
him.
yeah, in terms of what he's written, he can't be as openly cynical as like I can be, because these are still
Yeah, the
his
reader.
friends, and so he has to do like honest reporting and not put his opinion in there, and just leave it at the facts that he has and give like a vague conclusion of maybe it's all of these things at the same time.
Well, and if you just got in a shooting match and a car accident and your trailer got burned to the ground, and right before that, you see this family and this dude and this random guy that you don't really know, but you're associating all of them as, you know, anti-trans, anti-gay, kind of whatever. And now dude shows up with a card at your new location. You're not going to be answering a lot of questions from that guy if you recognize him. They would just assume Ted was going to do the same thing that Sam probably did.
Even if not, I think they probably take it as we've been found, because I'm sure they don't want to be seen by anyone. They don't want it to be known. They don't want their location or whereabouts to be known by people and then
Anyone.
eventually get to these guys. So when
Yeah.
Ted gives and leaves the card there, that is like a sign. Okay, now the world knows where we are. If we contact this
We
person
got to
or if he
go.
comes back, we've been found, and then there's danger again.
Yeah,
So,
I think it's a
I mean,
fair assessment.
if you suspect someone trying to burn your house down, and there's no recourse for these guys to go to the police and expect the police to do an investigation and all of that, because anyone who lives on the flats sort of knows that the county and the entire
Doesn't
government
care.
system in that area is not on their side at all. It's not there to help them in any way. So at
Yeah,
that
so
point, it's
it's,
just better to leave, I think.
and that lawlessness is very, you know, like, watch a Western, you know, and they're all filled with that. And this is true to form.
Yeah,
Uh,
there's good sides to that. It is attractive in some ways, but then there are times when you actually need law enforcement. And if you
yeah,
find yourself in that position,
good luck.
just someone with more power and more weapons can come and destroy you and take everything away.
Yeah.
And then after this, I want to talk about a meeting that La Puente holds every month, where I think Ted attends that with Matt. It is a monthly staff meeting in the community room of a church in Alamosa, where different units of organization give reports and talk about the work they've been doing. Naturally, Matt was tasked with talking about their rural outreach program, because remember, he's the only person in that entire division, along with Ted, who's only there maybe a third of the time. So Matt is there to talk about the rural outreach work, and people seem to appreciate his stories for the glimpse they gave into the unknown world of the flats. We've talked about this before, how even though the flats are right there, the people are right there on the side of the highway. These are completely parallel societies, except when they intersect, when the county enforcement goes there to sort of give them a hard time about septic tank. Otherwise, people in like the online, so it is for them a glimpse into a completely different world. So they find it
Well,
fascinating.
you remember when he goes to that lecture at the university, and
Yeah, Adams did.
he's like, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. Like, he's presenting stuff that maybe is old news, isn't really accurate. You know, so they're creating myths all over the place. So if there's a myth about Trinidad being a transgendered operation town, and you know, you've got this lawless nature of things, and nobody really asks what happens on the plains, and you're on your own. And then you have groups like La Puente, because I think what you're going to say next is that the leader talks about what kind of people are their community or who they're helping, and then Matt disagrees with the reasons
Yeah.
and principles.
Their idea is that you help anyone and everyone in any situation. So in the exercise that they do at the end of the meeting, they ask, if you found yourself without money, support, or housing, would you ask for help? And most of the people present say yes, which is the answer the person was looking for, because their reasoning is, if you're not able to accept help without judgment, you're unable to give help without judgment. And there is this underlying sense of, you help anyone that needs help, and you don't ask any questions, which is like a reasonable thing to say, because you don't want these organizations like La Puente to be arbiters of who deserves help and who doesn't.
Yeah,
Just like
yeah,
doctors are not supposed to
yeah,
decide who deserves to be cured and who doesn't. Like, even if the person on the table is a hardened criminal, you still treat him and try to cure him, and you do the operation well. And so you don't do that. You're not there to judge and weigh in on moral issues. Just like the doctors are not supposed to weigh in on moral issues, people in La Puente are not supposed to judge people for the situation they're in and think about, what the person could do separately. They're just there to help them, which I agree and I totally understand. But Matt, sitting next to Ted, disagreed. He mutters, that was the exact situation I was in a year ago. I've got my gun and my tent and in the woods, and I'm going to take care of myself and my son. I like helping all varieties of people, but the target I like looking for is the people who help themselves, which most of my people do. And when he says my people, it is the people out on the flats and people there who are trying to do what they can to survive the harsh conditions and live with some sense of freedom. And that is the world that Matt is in for the most part. And that is the kind of people he likes, who are trying to pull themselves in a certain direction already. And then Matt is there to give them a hand and help them get there. And
you know,
no, I was
it's
just
a
going to say, I get that perspective as well.
I do too, and I mean, I think that what is slowly kind of being revealed there is that Ted has discovered that there's myths about this place that he's learned firsthand are flawed, and that the best way to really know this group of people is to be with them and without judgment. And part of what he's doing really well, that's kind of hard for the reader to kind of tolerate, is a lot of these people are fairly despicable. I mean, I think your theory about Sam is probably not too far off the mark, and yet you're like, well, some of what he's doing is kind of necessary for survival, I guess. But he early on is selling weed, and then some rando kind of hears about it, knows he's growing it, knows where they live, and then says, here's what's going to happen. You're going to give me all of your weed for this much money, or you're going to die. And his Sam's response is something like, let's go, man. Like
Yeah.
I'm not giving this stuff away, and I'm packing a gun too. So guess we're in a gunfight now. And that kind of reluctance to give up or back down or surrender just doesn't seem like it's in the DNA of anyone out there. And yet
Because
there's like, I just think, like he's really getting at that point that despite this, difficulty of accepting, derelict and lawless behaviors of the tribe as it kind of is or was, he still has this kind of respect for their ability to try. They're not just going and giving up and, writing their, please give me your change on a cardboard
yeah,
box in the street corner. Like they're still hashing it out there, and you got to give them some for that. But man, it is a different. I mean, they are off, not just off grid, but off government, off all resources, and they don't participate. So like when you meet, well, I mean, later we'll talk about the Dutch couple. The conspiracy stuff that comes with it is like, well, of course you guys think stuff that you don't
yeah,
participate in the world and you chose not to. So you can believe whatever you want. Anyway, I
yeah. I
think
was
it's
just going to
interesting
say
to
that
understand.
Sam's reluctance to back down in that situation is self-defense thing, because you don't want to be taken as a sucker. You don't want to bow down, because if you bow down to him, then number one, this motorcycle gang is going to keep coming for more. And then that gives a signal to other people in the region that, oh, this guy, he's kind of weak. We can go and nick $1 off him. So
Yeah.
for Sam, in some ways, it is very existential. And then he has stage 4 cancer anyway. So he's like, fuck it. I'm going to live on my terms, and I'm not bowing down to this, because if you take me out, you take me out. So he
Well, and
calls their bluff in some ways.
yeah. And I think that, like, if your speculation on what really happened with the shims is true, they didn't back down either. So say Sam comes in and he's like, hey, you're polluting my beach. We don't want your kind here. And we certainly don't want you, cooking meth or whatever. You can grow weed, but don't get our people addicted to your crappy drugs. Maybe. And so he's pretty offensive in his interaction, and maybe pulls a gun, throws a rock, rams their car. They ram back. They're not going to back down either. And then he's like, oh yeah, well, you don't back down from me, then I burn your house down, which he ultimately does. But there's still a reluctance to just give in, even if you're like wearing, red high heels on the beach or whatever.
Earlier, you mentioned that these people have no contact with the outer world. They're not in any of the systems. Like they're not involved with the government and any of that. And it is sort of like a self-selecting thing. That is what these people are looking for, because when they come to the valley, they come fully prepared, and they want just to be out on their own and be completely left alone. Even the interaction that they have with the county and anything is very inconvenient and annoying for them, because their whole idea is that we are here to be completely away from civilization. We don't want to worry about IDs, driver's licenses, any of that stuff. We want to be out here on our own. We don't want any handouts. We don't want anything else. So that is a self-selecting thing. And the world that Matt is immersed in is a world where people like this come and try to make a go of it.
Yeah. I think, you were asking about if we should rewatch, well, I guess it's not a rewatch for you for City Slickers, but I was thinking that you should watch the Deadwood series. I don't know if I mentioned that before, but there's like this lawlessness thing is real, and that reluctance to give up the resiliency of like all various types of people that find themselves in, at that point in time, a part of the United States that wasn't a state yet. So there was, just this territory that was very lawless, and the government really couldn't do anything about it until they, assumed that area, which was South Dakota and Wyoming and that part of the world. But it is interesting to see like this established little town that is the like old version of Mos Eisley space station or something, like it's just all the scum of the earth that are living out there, and it's all sin and villainy and whatever. I don't know. It's not entirely the same, but there's a lot of this that kind of translates. And
yeah, I
it's
just
weird.
looked it up. It's only 3 seasons, so we can talk about it offline and chat. Maybe we do that as like we would do a book. We just do the series and do it for 3 seasons.
Yeah.
So in the last episode, we talked about the Whirlies, the people who want to live without ID cards, the people who are like the Anne Franks of the situation, who tried to hide away in the cellar when Matt approached the property and only came out after they knew it was him and it wasn't the county enforcement, who were trying to live there undetected. So Ted has been trying to get a hold of them for a while. Clearly, since the winter, he's trying to get a hold of them, because when we last mentioned them, Matt was like going on their property and trying to give them wood. So he couldn't meet them on his first visit, I'm guessing. And then during his second visit during the summer, he sort of has a way in to get to meet them. In one of his meetings with Matt mentions he had recently met James and Roxanne Burley, that is their name, and believed they were living openly on their property again. Apparently, the county had backed off from their efforts of prosecuting them, and at least for the moment, they could live freely. Ted has been trying to meet the Worleys for a while at this point, and soon he meets someone who knows someone who knows the Worleys. So it's like one degree of separation from this new person that
Right.
he has met. Is good friends with them, in fact. So the person Ted knows is called Calvin, who is an aspiring writer, and the person he knows is called, her name is Vera, and I don't know if she goes to the same church as the Worleys or how they know each other, but they are very close. And Ted gets on a call with her. And after asking Ted some questions, she tells Ted that she was planning to see Worleys that evening for dinner. So she kind of like interrogates him, tries to understand what Ted's perspective is and worldview and why he might want to meet the Worleys. Because I think it comes up later that she was their attorney or advocate in the hearings. So she's very defensive of the Worleys anyway. She knows what they've been through. So she's kind of protective of who this new guy is and is he a detective or someone from the county or something like that. So she vets Ted basically and then clears him and tells him about the dinner that they're going to have that evening. So Ted, Calvin, and Vera all go for the dinner together. And the dinner is at the Polish couple's place. So Anya and Jurek, who you will talk about in a little bit, is a Polish couple who lives on the flats, and the dinner is on their property.
Yeah, I mean, and they're the interesting characters at the Worleys or at dinner, I think, because
Yeah.
they're just so bizarre. So they're from Poland. He he refused to pay some fees, gets pulled over in a traffic stop, and then refuses to roll his window down. They break the window and tase Anya, and there's two officers involved. In Cruz Soto, who we meet in the first chapter, I think he's there, and then another guy named Andrew Espinosa, who's arrested eventually for poaching and illegal hunts, which, like even the law is lawless. Just kind of, I mean, that's not even part of the Anya story so much. I think she makes a comment about when she gets tased that the way it felt was
It
still
was
like,
painful, but she was very
yeah,
angry, I think she says.
yeah. She's like, this hurt, but I'm just pissed, which is just like more of their, toughness that everybody seems to have. But they have all these conspiracy theories that I think Ted is, really struggles with, because, I mean, just to kind of bang through some of them, AIDS, it was a problem stemming from a wrong state of mind, and thereby death from it was easily preventable. I don't even know what that means. The CIA is run by the Vatican. The Church of England owns the Pentagon. John McCain gave Al Qaeda $800 million. We live in a corporate democracy. I mean, that one is like vaguely, I guess you could accept some of that. And then there's all this, like, the United States is incorporated and it's a registered corporation, clear, if you just look at a dollar bill or whatever.
So obvious.
And in the midst of like, they're just like, why don't you know this? They're telling him like he's never read a newspaper or something, and then his response is like, well, where are you getting this information? And they're like, the internet, dummy, where
Yeah.
else? And he's like, right,
Where you
where
get
else?
all
And
information, obviously.
um, yeah, and there's something about capital letters on all identification that makes each individual person enslaved and also somehow like an incorporation or something like that. And that's been true since Rome. Yeah, it's just like on and on with that stuff. And I think Ted is like in the nicest way possible, just going like, okay, this is just another way to look at the world. But he's, clearly not buying it. And the thing that, like, his version of not really liking the what he's learning is that he's mentions that he's disturbed by the fact that they're not from this country, and they
Yeah.
have these theories about it, and he's, kind of confused as to, well, why are you here again? And then what's his name, Jurek, says something like, well, we were running from the communists and the Nazis or whatever. And then Anya checks him and says, hey, you're born like 20 years after World War II. What are you
Yeah.
talking about? So even she's like,
And in all these conspiracies, I think the corporate democracy one is at least something that I can understand why they would believe in that, because it is very easy to make the argument that government is a business by, you could just use campaign donations as an example and make that case, and be a very strong case, because there is a
Yeah.
very good case to make that the lobbyists and the donations are what really dictates the laws that get passed in the US. And there's this theme in The Big Short, the movie as well, that 2008 collapse happened because a lot of the people who were writing these regulations in government, or who were responsible to keep these banking institutions in check, one way they sort of financed their life was after they were done doing their government stint, they would then go into these private institutions and work for them. So while they are part of the government and they're supposed to be regulating these people, they're also making contacts to get hired by these same people in the future. So there is like a lot of truth to that about how the government is corrupt, and there's a lot of legalized corruption in the US. But yeah, everything else is just crazy nonsense. And like at one point they asked Ted, hey, you're asking us all these questions about where we get our information. Where do you get your information from? And he
That's
says,
right.
the New York Times, like that is where I get most of my information. That is my favorite part of this entire
Yeah.
dinner. Like
Yeah.
when he says that, they looked at each other as though Ted were a type of imbecile they had heard about but never expected to meet in real life.
Who would read that? Yeah, that's pretty funny.
Really? You
Well,
trust the New York Times, the crooked media?
the part that kind of I kept like sifting through what is going on with these two, and that corporate thing was somewhat viable, and I kind of was not totally down the rabbit hole, but it felt like, you meet somebody like this and you have to kind of dig through the bullshit to finally go, oh no, well, there you might have something.
Have
I mean, I'm
something.
not going to
Yeah.
completely. I still don't want to talk to you anymore, especially if you're like not willing to, broaden your horizons beyond the crazy websites that you're getting all this information from. Um, and I'd imagine that I don't know. He never really follows up with it, but I bet he went back to his trailer and like checked out, like capital letters in documents or whatever. Like, why not search that and go like, oh, this is a very questionable source that you're using. If we want to call it a source, or a Reddit page or whatever. Um, so yeah, that part's kind of funny. I was going to tell you
Yeah,
something
there's a lot
else.
of things to that. So one is with the onset of internet and with the widespread dissemination of information, media literacy has become so much more important in today's time. Media literacy, and to just understand how arguments or how knowledge gets constructed, and how to check your sources, different ways in which you can do that, how to be like skeptical of a certain narrative being pushed, and why people do that. And, all of that is just so important these days, because I use a lot of Twitter, and then I've gotten to a point where I can sort of guess what has actually happened in the world on the basis of what a certain person is saying about the event. Now, I may not even have read anything specific about the instance itself, but you read like a right-wing account saying something being very gentle with something that Trump has done. That sort of gives you an idea that, okay, Trump has actually done something that's maybe 10 steps worse than this. But then this person is going to try to paint it in like the most forgiving and generous version of that. And I think, at least for me, Twitter has been great for that, to see how different people bend different narratives. And initially, it really used to get to me, but now it's just more of a media critique or critique of culture exercise, that okay, this is how discourses happen, and this is where the cutting edge of discourse is.
We were talking about both Matt and Ted's experience in like misinformation about the people that live out on the plains, and they both know firsthand what the reality is. But in their circumstance, nobody cares. Like the news media is not going to write up if somebody gets murdered. That's a meth dealer or whatever out on the plains. It's just, all right, well, I guess you guys solve your own problems. We don't need law enforcement. But like it's a it's a very small example of kind of what you're describing. Like
Yeah.
if you're doing the same thing with your information, and you have these kind of questionable sources and you assume it's true, that let's say next week, because Trump says that Zelensky is a dictator, he keeps saying that long enough, and you get enough Americans that are like, yeah, well, he's a dictator and he started this war and he could have left at any point. It's like, wait a minute, did you? What do you? How did? What are you
Yeah.
talking about? But like, if you're not really reading anything or having some objective opinion about it, yeah, you could just go like, yeah, I heard that Trinidad is where you get sex changes, and that's just a thing. It's been that way since the 60s or whatever, and it might have been a thing for a year, and that never happened again. And and people just keep believing that truth, and they never research it. So it's like, it's a similar kind of microcosm of that tendency. It's depressing, isn't it?
Very. And like, so to take the example of the valley, so let's say there's a news organization who is covering the valley and they have a certain bias. So from Ted's perspective, he can probably guess what has happened on the valley. So let's say they report on some prairie dweller has done something terrible, like these guys are growing weed and selling it to people and creating all this mayhem and ruining the texture of what the flats are supposed to be. And then if they write about this county enforcement guy rightfully stopped Anya in Zurich and they had to tase them because these were really unruly people who did something terrible or something like that. Ted can be in a position where he sort of understands where both these worlds operate, like what the county's perspective is and what their attitudes are, and where the valley dwellers are coming from. And he can probably get like a more textured understanding of the situation than someone who is just reading the news headline or the news article that this newspaper with a certain bias is printing,
Yeah.
right? So that
Yeah.
is sort of when you consume, when you read, I don't like the word consume, but when you read diverse enough arguments, you can sort of get a third person perspective almost because you know how both or multiple camps think and where these perspectives are coming from. That is a very difficult thing to do because for one, you have to entertain the ideas that you disagree with. You have to really sit down with them, think through them, see where that person is coming from and what their perspective is, and maybe be a little charitable, maybe critique it in your own mind, think about what the pros and cons are, and then do that entire exercise for the side that you agree with, and then some other side. And then, like, this is a lot of intellectual legwork that a lot of people are not willing to do. And there's another aspect to this. So I recently found a book called The Big Sort, written, I forget the author's name, but this was written like early 2000s, which is documenting how Americans have been sorting themselves willingly along ideological and political lines, because US is a country where everything becomes political, like the Democratic versus Republican divide subsumes all the issues that you can care about. And then he documents in that book how America, since the 1970s, mid 70s, when people started having enough money and options to move around, were willingly moving to enclaves of people that thought the way they did. So to document this, they look at election results because that is one place where everyone in the country is voting on the same issue, right? They're voting for either the Republican candidate to be president or the Democratic candidate to be president. So they look at that data and then they look at it on the county level, because you can have a state like Texas that is red, but then you can have counties, places like Austin that are super blue. So that is more relevant. The more relevant choice is the county in which you choose to live versus the state in which you decide to live. So they look at that, and in 1976, 50 or 60% of the country lived in places where the election race was very close, right? I don't remember the numbers, but in the 50 to 60% of the counties in the country, the race was sort of close and the difference was less than 20% between the Democratic and the Republican candidates. Take that to 2004, and I only have the number from 2004 because the book was published in 2007 or 8. The number is down to like 20%. Only 20% in the counties in the US had a difference smaller than 20%. So more and more people have gone either to red counties or blue counties, or made these counties more red and blue by just self-selecting the people that you choose to live with. That is sort of what has happened on a national level. And then you can see how these echo chamber dynamics have just further exacerbated since social media. And this book is important because a lot of the times when we talk about the clustering of like-minded people and we talk about echo chambers, we blame social media, right? This book in some ways predates the onset
Yeah.
of social media and just widespread internet on every device everywhere. And this is proof that this tendency of gravitating towards like-minded ideas, like-minded discourse, neighborhoods is happening since the 70s and 80s. So it is a 3-decade-long process. And yes, social media has made the problem worse because you can now have just the weirdest worldviews and have an argument that sustains all of that. You can create like a body of knowledge that completely supports whatever opinion that you might have. With enough work, you will also create a community online who all believe in the same idea, which is like a self-reinforcing mechanism. Because if you're surrounded by people who have the same beliefs, your beliefs tend to become more radical because there's nothing to check what you believe in, right? Which is like an argument for living in more diverse, intellectually diverse places, because you can still have an opinion, but you also see the other side because you've met a person who disagrees with you. So these people, they live out on the flat, so they're not surrounded by people who may have differing opinions, to sort of tie back to this situation. And they are on all the Facebook groups that give them all this bile of, if the letters on your ID are capitalized, you are basically a slave, and government is at one point they say that the government is corrupt, which means that it is invalid, which means they have no right to collect taxes, which means if you continue to pay taxes, you're a chump, which is, I think, sort of the foundation of all of their government skepticism. Because at the end of the day, these guys are people who want to be left alone, who don't want anything to do with the government and the world. And they still have to pay 25% of their income taxes. Fuck that. I'm not getting anything. I don't even have paved roads. I don't have water coming onto my property. Like, what am I paying
They
taxes
do have
for?
an argument there. Like, who they're not benefiting from any social services.
Think about the Shims. Think about the Shims. Their property burns down. They have no recourse to go to the police. If they make money and they pay 25% in taxes, what are they really getting in return is going to be their question. So you sort of...
security, I don't know.
I mean, there's a response to all of that, like social security, the national borders are secure. There is still just being in the US.
Yeah, but very little. Certainly not what you get
all of
living
that.
in it.
Yeah, there are all of those arguments, but you get why they have that skepticism.
Yeah, it's fair. So you're listening to, or you're reading Twitter as a, like, to use it as a litmus for what's going on?
So I've been on and off Twitter multiple times over the past decade. Like, I will use it and then I'm like, oh no, this is bullshit. I need to be away. People are evil or whatever. And then I'll come back. The reason I keep coming back is there are a lot of really interesting, I call them micro intellectuals, who have a reasonable following on Twitter. It could be between 1,000 to 10,000 people, but they're not published writers. They're not academics. They're just people with regular jobs, regular lives, who use social media as a tool for a richer intellectual life. Because a lot of people have this issue where they don't meet people who they can talk about certain issues. So they go to Twitter and they will post on Twitter. So it is very interesting for me in that sense, because you will see opinions on Twitter, good and bad, that don't make it to print, don't make it to the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, because these people are not in contact with, they don't have a degree from Columbia. They don't know anyone in New York to publish their opinions and articles. So they just put everything on the internet. So it is more of a grassroots, bottom-up uh, hierarchy where if your opinions get credibility, you get followers, and then there's good and bad. There are some very interesting people along that. So you get to see the entire spectrum of opinion. Less so now because of Elon Musk trying to make it more right wing. But even today, if you compare, I don't recommend you do it, but if you look at Twitter, if you look at Threads, if you look at Blue Sky, the different platforms, you will see a more diverse and richer discourse on Twitter versus the other apps, because the other apps are very much, it is almost exclusively left leaning. And Twitter is something that now leans very right, but there are still old users who are left, who are still left leaning, who are still on Twitter and who still will put forward the left side, the leftist opinion, which makes it interesting. So there is, I think, there's a quote that goes something like, uh, news news is the first draft of history. Twitter is something like that because it is like real time, it is live, people can post instantaneously. So it is like the live discourse of 500 people, 500 million people happening online. A few hundred are probably daily users, but like it is like on the cutting edge of national and global discourse. So it has that value to it. I don't recommend other people to be on Twitter. It is not something that you need to do. It is not something that I recommend everyone should do. It is just something that I find interesting now, and I do it for those reasons. It's just fascinating to see the spin people would put on different opinions. So all the stuff that Trump is doing with Doge and all of the stuff that Elon Musk is doing, like cutting stuff from national forests and getting into the treasury system and stuff like that, there is no criticism from the right for any of that. And
It's just
these are
nuts.
these are not, so I need to make this point that these are not crazy right-wing conspiracy theorists. These are very intelligent people who lean right, but the only thing they see in all of this is that this is going to make the government more disciplined. That is their opinion. Now, I disagree with that. I have a lot of questions to ask about, yes, you can want the government to be more disciplined, but why do you need to fire forest rangers? There is a due process for all of this. All of that is, none of this makes it to the discourse, which makes me a bit sad because the process is no longer important, it seems like, to a great majority of America. It's just that as long as the dictator is someone I agree with, doesn't matter how he gets it done. Like Trump
Yeah.
tweeted the other day that he who saves his country does not violate any law. I'm like, you kidding?
Which is a quote from a Napoleon movie that isn't
Yeah, I think
real.
it's an
It
apocryphal
was
quote.
a
Yeah,
yeah, it was a scripted quote. Yeah. Fucking
yeah.
jackass.
So not to get into politics, but yeah,
Yeah.
that is why it's interesting. It's to sort of challenge myself and my biases. Like, you have your
Well, it's
opinions, but
good.
you need to know what the other side thinks about and how they talk about these issues as well.
Well, I think it's interesting. We didn't go through, he puts these quotes at the beginning of the chapters, and one of them is, it's our patriotic duty to see the humanity in people with whom we disagree. It's kind of exactly what you're talking about, and really what he's doing with all these kind of crazy characters that he's learning about.
And so we come now towards the end of the chapter, and Ted has been in the flats for a while now, like we talked about. He went there during the winter. It is summer during the stories of this chapter, so there's a bit of back and forth, I'm guessing, between New York and here. This may have been him doing a stint in the valley, going back to New York, coming back in the summer, but he has spent a bit of time living on the Gruber's property. And with so much going on and so many people living there, some of it is beginning to gnaw at him. So when he was there during winter, there was no mention of Lisa, Josh and Meg, Sam and Cindy. So I'm guessing when he agreed to live on that property, it was just him and the Grubers. But now it is more like a carnival. Every day there's a lot of chaos and a lot of people that's getting to him. Sam and Cindy, who are also living on the property, like to go to sleep watching TV, and to do this, they would fire up the generator at night and leave it running until it ran out of gas. Ted was used to the sound of generator during winters when you needed it when the batteries ran out, but the fact that this was happening during the summer was beginning to irritate him. Even given that he was in the middle of so much space, he began to wonder whether it made sense to live so close to annoyances one might find in a crowded apartment building. So he starts to think where else he might live, because from his perspective, he deals with this bullshit in New York. His everyday life is in New York, and there he can rationalize the chaos, the sound um, of the
The
neighbors and
honking
all of that,
cars,
honking
the triple
cars,
car,
the heating system,
was
and
the
all of
ice
that.
cream man.
Yeah. Oh God, the ice cream machine in New York. So, fun fact. So, where we lived in Washington Heights, the ice cream machine was right there, and I'm sure you've heard the jingle
Ice cream truck,
sound
right?
go off. Yeah, the ice cream truck. And when we were new, I actually went to the truck guy, to the ice cream guy, and sort of confronted him that you're not supposed to do this. You're not allowed to do this. And he just looked at me like, the fuck are you talking about? Who complains about the ice cream truck? Are you insane?
I
He
sell
was
ice cream,
very
buddy. Get the hell out
perspired.
of here.
A lot like these people must have looked at Ted when he said he read the New York Times. That was the sort of look he gave me. So you're complaining about this? I've come here every day for 6 years. No one has said anything. What's wrong with you?
Nor have I sold any ice cream.
Uh, yeah.
He's selling something else out of there.
Yeah, that's maybe a front for something else. But yeah, I digress. Ted knows that he needs a place close to someone he can trust. So at this point now, Ted is thinking about where he can move, what he can do, but he knows he needs to live close to a person he knows, because he's not going to be there full time. He's probably only going to be there a third of the time at most. And then when he's not there, his place is going to be vulnerable to attacks. People could come in and steal stuff. He's seen temporary trailers being overturned for axles and stuff like that. So he is very wary about where he might move, even though he knows he maybe needs to move away from the Grubers. He thinks about a property near Troy, that long-term resident that we've talked about in the past episodes, that had a well and a septic tank on the property. The trailer, long and light blue, was likely in a pretty rough shape. It hadn't been lived in since its last occupant, a friend of Troy's, had died 4 years earlier. So it has remained vacant there for 4 years, must have had a lot of wear and tear. It's been through the seasons. So Ted asks Troy how much would a place like that cost? Because the place, I'm sure, is attractive for multiple reasons. One is because it's close to Troy, and then it already has a septic tank and a well. So he doesn't have to go to a spring to get water, and he doesn't have to worry about hiring contractors to put septic tanks in. And there's also the case for the price that is quoted to him is going to be all he has to pay. You know, a lot of uncertainty is taken away. He doesn't have to guess what a contractor would take for a septic tank and all of that, because the septic tank is there and it's move and ready essentially the moment he can get the temporary trailer up to his needs, or he can just bring something in with himself. So he asks Troy how much would a place like that cost, and Troy was reluctant to guess and says, out here it's worth what somebody will pay. Yeah, but what might somebody ask, and what might somebody pay? Ted sort of pushes him on it.
It's like
and
a
he says,
terrible negotiation tactic.
Yeah. And I think Ted generally in the Valley is not trying to negotiate hard with people, because even when he buys the trailer and the rent with the Grubers, he doesn't negotiate, because he knows this money means a lot to them. For me, it is sort of chump change. If I get if I get a trailer for $4,000, the $4,000 mean a lot more to Geneva Duarte than it does to me, Ted Conover, published author of 8 books, teacher in New York. You know, my rent is probably more than that.
Yeah.
So he says it might be worth $20,000, but he happened to know it wasn't for sale. And Ted says, "Well, let me know if you ever hear that it is." So
yeah, when he starts
$20,000 for a land with septic tank and a well on it is not too bad if you can figure the rest out, like the winter and
you just have to get power. The power thing's a real bitch out there. I would think that putting up a lot of solar and wind would be the move. But yeah, when you started talking about this, I was there was a part of me that was a little bit like sad because, he seems to kind of be building a bond with the Gruber daughters and their walks. And, he's mentioned something like they are regularly, one of them is at his door, like whenever he's home. And they're probably genuinely curious to have an experience of another person in their world that maybe seems a little bit more stable, relatively normal, intelligent, whatever, but also somebody that they can teach. So, they can explain the things that they know about their world to somebody that, they assume doesn't, and maybe he doesn't. Um, and that part, I would think he would miss. Maybe not some of the other shenanigans, or wondering like, did Sam light somebody's trailer on fire? And like, I'm going to be living
Am I
next to
living
him
next to
now.
an
And
arsonist now?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, no, I
So
think he enjoys living with the Grubers and the kids and all of that. I think that adds a lot of social texture to his day-to-day life in the valley. And I think he mentions in the book as well that he's glad to have them. Sort of helps him with the feelings of loneliness that you can experience on the flats. But when you live next to someone you suspect to be an arsonist, when there's people who love to have guns and you're someone who doesn't want to be around guns a lot, and then they keep their
and they
generator
have
on
two.
all night and stuff, you kind of look at your options because he's right. Why would you be in all this space and all surrounded by cheap land everywhere and put up with the same issues you would put up in a crowded
In New
apartment in
York,
New York City?
right?
Like, this is
Even
supposed to
worse
be a
though.
break from those annoyances.
Yeah, yeah, that's fair. He's also, that we didn't mention, once they move to the new place, Sam has two pit bulls on like ropes, and every time Ted leaves his place, like chomping at the bit and barking like they're gonna kill him and snap the rope. And ugh, I would
Shit
never
like
get
that
used
gets
to
to you.
that. I would hate that. Yeah, like every day I'm going out to like start up the generator. You're like, oh
Yeah, and
Jesus, I don't even
more
need
irritating.
coffee
Yeah,
anymore and just go out and get barked at.
and the irritating bit about annoyances like that is when sometimes you just feel like you want to go out. Just there's no reason, you just want to walk out your front door, stand
Yeah,
in the front of your house, and then come back in. Now, if there are dogs who are barking at you at every time you do that, you're less likely to do it. It's like when it is cold out, really cold, you're too timid to sort of brave that and go out. So it just keeps you locked in to your house the entire time. It's like that. I don't want to feel that. I don't want to feel the dogs barking at me, so I'm just not going to go out unless I need to. And you basically a prisoner in your little trailer at that point.
I get old pretty quick.
This is where the third chapter ends. Next week, we will discuss the fourth chapter of Tree Plant, Colorado, and we will see you in the next one.